Okay, well, good morning, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone via Zoom and also that are in the room here at Lyon Township. And Lyon Township is very, very happy to host this event. We appreciate all the participants. And today, this meeting is being recorded, just so that you all know. And we will have a link up on our websites after the meeting is over. One at Lyon, Hamburg Township, and Green Oak Township. Lyon, Hamburg, and Green Oak Township will all have the link up and running. That being said, I'd like to bring our tech person in and explain some of the rules of today's Zoom meeting. And his name is Ken Melbourne from Merge Live. Ken, please.
Thank you, John. Yeah, for anyone that would like to interact in this meeting, we'll need to have you raise your virtual hand. The virtual hand feature typically is found at the bottom of your desktop. You may have to move your cursor down to wake up the toolbar. Tablets, they hide those in different areas. You'll have to find that. But once the virtual hand is raised, we will call on you in the order that you come into the queue. That said, there are some people that are on regular telephones. So the way that you raise your virtual hand on the telephone is you press *9. Once you're in the queue on a regular telephone, we'll ask that you unmute. We're not able to unmute you here. You'll have to unmute by pressing *6. So a couple commands for the people on regular telephone: *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute.
Thank you, Ken. First of all, this meeting was put together for the compliances and challenges for PFAS that all of our municipalities in Michigan and cities actually are having. And this is basically more of an informational meeting that we'd like to make sure that everyone knows it's a collaboration of everyone in Michigan to try to get this PFAS out of our system. And we all understand that. And this is totally a meeting that's informational to our entire state of Michigan. That being said, today we are going to have the introduction to our meeting by Anthony Dowson. He works with Highland Treatment, Inc. Our current status by Kathleen Root, Multi Lakes Water and Sewer Authority. We have the applicability of the 201 and impacts by Bob Zewald, Environmental Resources Group. Regulatory discussion by Beth Solera, Rosati Schultz, attorney firm. And the experience and concerns and economic impacts and compliance plan by Pat Hall, Hamburg Township. And after that, we'll also have our path forward discussion, and that'll be coming up at the end. So that being said, I would like to turn the mic over to Anthony Dawson at Highland Treatment. Anthony, come on up.
Good morning, everyone. The reason we've been getting together with Multi Lakes, Lyon Township, Hamburg Township, several mobile home communities that we operate the wastewater plants for, we've all been tested for PFAS in our monitoring wells, and we have tested above the new drinking water limits that Eagle has submitted. So doing investigations, testing, sampling, notification, and education to the public has been our primary goal here. So far, we've tested numerous drinking water wells, and we've had all non-detects in the drinking water wells. The only thing that's had the over limits have been the monitoring wells. So we've contracted with Mala and her group, Bob, Energy Resource Group, helping us with our consulting. Working with our engineer, Leslie Zawada, from Civil Engineering Solutions, and basically our township attorneys to look at legal aspects. So right now, our concern is that PFAS is everywhere. Everyone knows this. It's a forever chemical. It's found in everything. And our concern is with the state of Michigan putting these new implementations in place when no one at state or federal level has banned the use and selling of any compounds with PFAS. Our challenge is undaunting. So we are working to figure out where it's coming from, but until we can get a regulation on the use of it, we really don't have much that we can do. We are basically a pass-through. We don't know where it's coming from, but we are trying to figure this out. So we'd really like to work with Eagle. We want to avoid 201 our belief is that we need a different, separate category for these issues in the monitoring wells. Instead of going 201, we'd really like to work with them and the legislators to figure out a better path forward to keep everyone in compliance and yet still, remove this harmful chemicals. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And now we're going to move on to the current status report by Kathleen Wood at Multi Lakes and Sewer Authority. Kathleen?
Good morning. So according to the state of Michigan, one or more groundwater monitoring wells with an exceedance of the Part 201 groundwater protection criteria for any of the 7 regulated PFAS is considered contaminated or a Part 201 site. And according to the state right now for PFOA, that max contaminant level for the state of Michigan is 8, and for PFAS, it is 16. For the proposed enforceable MCLs for the Environmental Protection Agency, it's going to be 4 for each. So right now we're having issues at meeting the state levels, and if the federal government steps in, then we're really it's going to be everywhere. As Anthony mentioned, it's absolutely everywhere. It's in household products. It's in your takeout containers, pizza boxes. It's man-made product that needs to be dealt with at the source and not for processing plants like sewer authorities. It has been detected in both in Hamburg. It's been detected in Lyon. It's been most recently detected at Multi Lake Water and Sewer Authority. It's important to note that none of the drinking water wells have been impacted, but we are all now labeled as a Part 201 site because, according to the state, it's detected there, and the wastewater treatment plants are considered a source of PFAS. As far as we're concerned, it didn't happen overnight that this occurred. It happened, it's taking years for this to happen. So we really feel that phase 1 would be to locate the source and go after the source of this contaminated product. We need funding for sure from the government or from the state in order to clean our equipment or remove what needs to be removed in order to replace perhaps sand beds, if that's what it takes. For sure, our infrastructure needs to be cleaned or repaired or upgraded. And there has to be another phase of compliance issues. We can't, if this has taken so long for this to happen, we certainly need a long time in order to comply. And we don't believe that being labeled as a 201 site, being put on the map, MPART map with a blue dot, is doing anybody any justice.
Thank you, Kathleen. We're going to move on to the applicability of Part 201 and its impacts by Bob Zewald, Environmental Resource Group. Bob?
He's muted.
Yeah, he's there.
He's muted. Yeah.
Sending him a code now.
There we go. Can you hear me now? Are we all good?
Yes.
Yep.
We are good. Go ahead.
Well, hi, I'm Bob Zwald. I'm a senior scientist and vice president at Environmental Resources Group. I've been doing 201 sites for about 35 years. I'm not going to go through all my qualifications and that kind of stuff, because just suffice to say, I've been doing this stuff for a really long time. Both 201 sites and Part 213 sites, which are leaking underground storage sites. The emerging contaminant issue has really become a super hot topic, and great for my business, but not so great for the people who are being regulated by it. But I just want to give you kind of an overview of where I think Eagle is coming from in using 201 as a tool. I am not an attorney, so I can't get too far into the legal ramifications or the legal justification for all of this, but I can tell you, just by looking at statute, I can tell you where they're coming from. And don't kill the messenger. I guess I'm just relaying the information. But the regulations we're dealing with are, Act 451 of the Michigan National Resources Protection Act, or NREPA. And that deals with kind of all things environmental, everything from landfills to groundwater and soil contamination. We're dealing with part 201, which is the part that does deal with ground and soil water contamination, cleanup and remedial activities. Surface water issues go to the Water Division. Part 201 is handled by the Remediation and Redevelopment Division, where surface water goes to Water Division, which is usually part 31 stuff. And there's obviously overlap, and one of the ones of concern is when we have a groundwater surface water interface, when groundwater is discharging to surface water, then you have, once it gets into the surface water part, the Water Division will be involved, as well as the RRD. So next slide. So there's a lot of definitions and a lot of regulations in part 201, a lot of things to say, and I just wanted to kind of summarize where I think Eagle, the definitions of the pertinent things that Eagle is using to put wastewater treatment plants on the 201 facility list. Number one is the definition of a hazardous substance, which is any substance that the department demonstrates on a case-by-case basis poses an unacceptable risk to public health, welfare, safety, environment, blah, 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 blah. And typically there's a lot of scientific study that goes into that. What defines a hazardous substance? A lot of times it's if it's listed by the EPA as hazardous substance, Eagle will pick it up. But in some cases, such as emerging contaminants, they can go on a case-by-case basis. So there's a little bit of nebulous or arbitrary assignment there. And then a release is any spilling, leaking, pumping, pouring, emitting, emptying, et cetera, of a hazardous substance into the environment. So if I know a lot of you have groundwater discharge permits, if you exceed those limits, you have essentially caused a release of a hazardous substance. And next slide, please. And if you do that, a facility, and that's a big word, that's the definition of what gets you on this 201 list, as it were, is any place or parcel or parcels of property or portion of a property where a hazardous substance in excess of concentrations that satisfy the cleanup criteria has been released, deposited, disposed of, or otherwise comes to be located. And that's the key thing, comes to be located. With your groundwater discharge permit, however it got there is essentially what that means. And then remedial action, in a couple of these we're going to talk about a little bit later in the presentation, but that includes cleanup, removal, containment, isolation, basically the cleanup of this issue of whatever this contamination is by various methods, including monitoring, maintenance, or the taking of, and I highlighted this, other actions that may be necessary to prevent, minimize, or mitigate injury to public health. And then I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Next slide, please. All right, how it's supposed to be applied. Michigan, as well as several other states, use a risk-based approach to cleanup based on exposure pathways. And by risk, we mean what is the risk of this contamination reaching an exposure point? Exposure point being the human body, or the flora or fauna or whatever. Is somebody or some animal or some surface water being exposed. Exposure pathways are basically the link between the release and that source or that population. And there's 5 elements on the right side of the page there that have to be present for there to be a complete exposure pathway. Contaminant source, which would be the PFAS in the groundwater or soil. The environmental fate and transport has got to be mobile or somehow traveling to a exposure point. An exposure point, in our case, I think the best idea we would say would be a drinking water well. You know, is this contamination getting to that drinking water well down gradient of the plume? The exposure route would be how it's getting into the body. So if you have a well, you're drinking that water, and that's the route would be ingestion and a potentially exposed population. And that's what we talked about earlier, the people, the flora, the fauna that are potentially exposed to this contamination. These 5 elements determine whether the pathway is complete, potential, or whether it can be eliminated. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to get too much in detail on this flow chart, but we can go through each one of these things and, yes, no. And if any of the things that we discussed before have a no answer to them, then you do not have a complete exposure pathway. However, if there is potential, and I realize that is a hugely arbitrary term, for any contaminant to reach an exposure point, then you have a potential exposure pathway and that's been eliminated. Our goal is to eliminate, or your goal would be, Eagle would make your goal to be, to eliminate the exposure pathway. So get rid of any complete exposure pathways and get rid of any potential exposure pathways. Once you do that, you would get a no further action, things would be fine, and get you off the list, hopefully. Next slide, please. So how would we eliminate exposure pathways? And this is where a consultant comes in and helps you once you've been put on the list. Okay, you've been assigned, you have to clean this up or somehow prove that there are no potential exposure pathways or complete exposure pathways. And there are several ways, and this is what I was talking about, the other ways. One would be further evaluation of the 5 elements of what makes a complete exposure pathway. Is the contaminant source migrating? Is it in a separate aquifer? Are there truly exposure points? I mean, are there down gradient wells of the source area? Are the wells in a different aquifer than where the groundwater discharge, the groundwater releases happened? Is there a sufficient clay or whatever barrier or bedrock barrier between the contamination and the exposure point? Those things can get kind of expensive. I mean, you're looking at, pretty extensive hydrogeologic investigations, the kind of stuff I love to do. But it's not cheap and it can be kind of costly. Probably not anywhere near as costly as cleanup, removal, containment, isolation, or some of these other things. The best example that I could come up with for a groundwater discharge that you have to clean up would be installing a pump and treat groundwater remediation system where you're pumping the groundwater, the contaminated groundwater through a treatment system and then discharging it as clean. When we're down into the part per trillion and even going down in what looks like it's going to be the part per quadrillion level of PFAS and PFOA, that could be extremely costly and cost prohibitive. And it'd be long term. I mean, basically, I've been running groundwater systems since I started my career, and they're still running. And those are easy contaminants like petroleum-based contaminants, benzene, and those kinds of things. So hopefully we don't have to get to that point. Other actions could be like long-term monitoring. If we know that there's a down gradient well, but we have monitoring wells between them that are clean, we could make the case that, hey, we have, the contamination is not migrated to an exposure point. We're going to be monitoring that. If it does, then we'll move on and see, but we can certainly be constantly, quarterly or annually monitoring the fate and transport of that contaminant plume. Another thing would be land use restrictions. How you would, a good example would be prohibition of groundwater monitoring wells, making everybody go on city water. That's a real tough one to get through with private residences. A lot of people just don't want to go on public water. But I know in the city of Detroit, city of Detroit is a good example where it's illegal to install a monitoring well, or excuse me, a groundwater drinking well. Those are the kinds of things you could use to eliminate exposure pathways as well. Obviously, this is it's a costly way, no matter what you go, which way you go. I'm hoping that, and I think there's some equal people involved in this, I'm hoping that they're listening and realize that, putting you guys on the 201 list may not be the solution to get this done, but I see where they're coming from, and I see the legal jurisdiction and what they're doing. And I'll leave the rest up to the lawyers. And I think that's my last slide. I don't know what's going on with questions or comments, if we're saving them till the end or at the end of every presentation, or how that's working, but I'm open to questions as well.
Yeah, Bob, I think we will leave them to the end, please.
Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Bob, for that presentation. We're going to move on to the regulatory discussion, and that's going to be presented by Beth Sorella from Rosati Schultz. Beth?
Morning. My name is Beth Sorella. I work for the law firm of Rosati Schultz, Jopik, and Amsbuchler. We represent multiple municipalities throughout the state of Michigan, mostly in Southeast Michigan. And unfortunately, many of these municipalities at this point are falling under this Part 201 designation as a result of PFAS, PFOA in sources that are not under regulatory control at this point. Most of the sources from a community in the area that we are working with are residential sources. PFAS is still being manufactured legally, and it's found in, as indicated in previous slides, household products that, toilet paper. We saw a slide of toilet paper. Makeup products, wrappers. These are things that are not lawfully controlled under any regulation, state, federal, at this point, and are unable to be controlled from a source. So that leaves all these municipalities who are basically the sort of end recipient of these chemicals that are in residential products as the sort of target of regulation in this case. As Bob previously discussed, right now that's being controlled under the Part 201 of Act 51 state legislation. So it's being handled currently under a more adversarial than a collaborative process. And what I think these communities are here to pursue and to discuss and to hopefully get to a point where this situation is being addressed in a more collaborative manner regulatorily rather than an adversarial manner, because just the adversarial labeling of a Part 201 violator does not, at this point, given the inability to stop the source, help any resulting removal of the source. So the labeling under the statute, I guess, is from a public policy perspective, what the municipalities are hoping to start the discussions with from a regulatory process, and potentially to move from a adversarial seeming process where a statutory violation is put on the record and then, publicly designated statewide, to move to a more rule-based process that is developed collaboratively between the municipalities, their consultants who are experts on this type of issue, and the state, to come up with how do we work together to address this? In how do we work together to address removal, control, maintaining people's health without adversarially impacting all of these communities that are right now using their best efforts to keep this under control. So from a starting perspective, I think what Bob brought up is control under PA 451. Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act, currently looking at the definition of facility is I think where would be a good start to get this issue out of a adversarial process and into a more collaborative process. So currently, section 126 of Part 201, section 26 of Part 201 has a definition of facility, as Bob pointed out, and facility currently is defined as means any area, place, parcel, or parcels of property, or portion of a parcel of property where a hazardous substance in excess of the concentrations that satisfy the cleanup criteria for unrestricted residential use has been released, deposited, disposed of, or otherwise comes to be located. So in this circumstance, these municipalities are dealing with otherwise comes to be located. They obviously they are not the source of the PFAS, and in most cases, either are unable to track or know it's coming from residential uses and are unable to control the source. So the definition goes on to allow, for public policy reasons, other types of uses and have been excluded from the definition of facility. Facility does not include any area, place, parcel, or parcels of property or portion of parcel of property where any of the following conditions are satisfied. And the statute contains a number of other exclusions whereby the legislature has made a determination that it's not in the best interest of society. It's not a good public policy choice. There are better ways to handle this than adversarially, because potentially for this reason, the violator, the label violator, was not the source, and there's a better way to handle it. So in this case, our suggestion would be to add an additional subsection to the exclusions under the definition of facility. Subsection 7 would state, as another exclusion from a Part 201 violation definition of facility, the state or a local unit of government operating a wastewater treatment plant pursuant to a state or national permit issued pursuant to Rule 323.2101, if the state or local unit of government was not the source of the release. So that source, again, incorporates another existing definition under Part 201. So currently, source is defined, and it could stay defined as it is, so long as these municipalities are excluded when they are not the source. So just scrolling down. source is defined as means any storage, handling, distribution, or processing equipment from which the release originates and is first enters the environment. So these communities are not the source. So the suggestion would be to start with the definitions and make them an exclusion from the source. Second recommendation would be to potentially amend. The next slide would show amending. Oh no, that was correct. Subsection 26, the liability provisions of Part 201. Currently, Part 201 talks about liability. Who is liable? Who is liable for contamination under Part 201? Subsection 3 states, notwithstanding subsection 1, the following persons are not liable under this part with respect to contamination at a facility resulting from a release or threat of release, unless the person is responsible for an activity causing that release or threat of release. So already we're looking at responsibility, and there are subcategories here of, again, other uses that the legislature has determined would not be in the best public policy interest to pursue in an adversarial manner to make a correction. So we would again suggest adding a similar statement to this section of the statute that states the state or local unit of government operating a wastewater treatment plant pursuant to state or local permit issued pursuant to Rule 323.2101, if the state or local unit of government was not the source of release. So again, let's take these municipalities who are trying and hoping to work to address this on a long-term basis that is workable for both, workable for everybody from a financial perspective and from a technological perspective at this given point. Work with the state, work with, the regulations that are out there, and come up with another regulatory means of how we address finding an exceedance of the limits on the site. So that is our suggestion, is to start by taking this type of issue out of Part 201, come up with a new regulatory means, whether it be under Part 41 or Part 22 of the rules, with the state, with Eagle, working with our local communities, working with our consultants to come up with a process that is collaborative, a process whereby everybody can look at the costs, everybody can look at the current technology, and everyone can look at the source that is actually the source that is currently not regulated, and deal with this in a manner that is doable for these municipalities without an adversarial process.
Okay, thank you, Beth. That was very good. We're going to move on to the next slides, and they were put together by Hamburg Township Pat Hall, supervisor. And the experience, concerns, economic impacts, and compliance plans are the same, basically, as Lyon Townships. So Pat has put together a very good slide presentation for you, and I'd like him to explain that. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. Pat Hole from Hamburg Township. Just to kind of lay a foundation here that I think is foundational to the topic we're addressing here, is what we're trying to deal with in Hamburg Township is a serious health hazard, a serious contaminant. We don't want to do anything adverse to our population, but the discharge from our wastewater treatment plant is actually less than the environmental background levels of these chemicals. For example, there's one study from Antarctica that shows that the snow in Antarctica has more PFAS in it than what we are discharging from a wastewater treatment plant. Yet in the end, we are labeled as a 201 site. Hamburg is a bedroom community, 24,000 people. 98.7% of our sewer REUs are residential. We have virtually no heavy industry. We have a few small industrial operations. And the vast majority of that 1.3% that is not residential is commercial, Kroger's, strip centers, pharmacies, things like that. So what we have is we are confronted here by a situation, as everyone said, and I'm not going to belabor it, we really have no control over. It's my understanding that all groundwater discharge plants that have been tested have had exceedances. That was some information I had 8 or 10 days ago. There may have been some others, but everyone universally, all groundwater plants exceed the standard. That's difficult for us to deal with. We also know if you're in Livingston County, there's been some news coverage of a farm that was applying biosolids as a fertilizer. And eventually they ended up getting shut down. They had tests conducted on the farm and of the beef that they were producing that exceeded the limits. This is pretty catastrophic. So we have to move forward and look at the costs. And the human health concern is our primary objective here. We want to deal with it. But what is it going to cost our residents to deal with it? So based on some trends and based on some hypothesis, it's quite evident that we are probably not going to be able to land apply our biosolids. So what are we going to do with them? Are we going to incinerate them? Or are we going to landfill? Right now, we're spending approximately $52,000 to land apply our biosolids. An analysis of the anticipated costs, if we would have to landfill them, would take us from 5 cents a gallon to somewhere between $1.50 and $2 a gallon. So let's ballpark that at $1.70 a gallon to remove our biosolids. We know that testing is taking place. We are a little behind Lyon Township in terms of the requirements for testing, but I think their numbers are about $60,000. We at Hamburg are somewhere around 15 or 20 now. But looking at that, let's add in $50,000 or $60,000 a year for testing. Those numbers do not contemplate anything to do with plant improvements, remediation, or anything else. So let's roll in 1.7 million in additional expenses for our 3,300 users. And I think if we could go to the next slide, that's what I was. So the next slide is a spreadsheet, and here's the numbers. It's a little hard to follow that as we go forward. But right now, our quarterly O&M charge per REU is $155.50. If we could go to the next slide, please. There's a graph that illustrates what could happen simply based on this 1.7 million in additional expenses. Once again, no capital expense, no remediation. This is simply biosolid disposal and testing. On the right-hand side, you see lots of higher costs. Let's go to the next slide, which seals the deal. Our quarterly REU charges just to deal with biosolid disposal and testing goes from $155.50 to $300 per REU. I'm a bit of an idealist. I think a lot of people in local government really are. We like to help people. That's our job here. I get a great deal of satisfaction from helping someone with a problem. But what we're dealing with in the PFAS, PFOA realm is a serious health hazard that we have absolutely no control over. We don't generate it. That's been belabored here quite extensively. We can't control it. We don't have any idea where all of our sources are, but I'm assuring you that if our residents are 98.7% residential, it's coming from a residential source. So what are we going to do? We are striving here to figure out what the goal line is. What is the vision of success? And being an idealist, which I think a lot of us are, how do we get there in the most economical manner for our residents? We don't want to get going down side alleys and unproductive activities and unnecessary expense. What we seek, I know what we specifically seek in Hamburg, is true and serious collaboration with everyone. We don't have the answers. I don't have the answers. I've got lots of questions. Our folks have lots of questions. Everyone involved in this has questions. And it seems to me that if we can really sit down at the table together and talk about our questions, and I'm sure that all of the answers aren't out there, but what we can answer, let's get answered. And what we can't answer, let's agree to work together to come up with an answer that best reduces the health hazard while doing it as economically as we possibly can. Final comment, I don't want to get choked. We at the local level are the face of government. We had some real issues in Hamburg a few years ago with roads. And I had a really cool spiel about, it's state funding and it comes down through the road commission, and townships were taken out of the road business in 1951 by a constitutional amendment and blah, blah, blah. And this little gentleman looks at me and he says, that's all fine and dandy. I can't get my senator or my state rep to call me. You're standing here in front of me. You are my local government. Now fix my damn roads before I choke you. So, help us not get choked on this one. Let's make sure that we're doing this as effectively as we can. I think that John is going to address now the path forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat. Okay, so now I believe we're going to open this floor up to open discussion about paths forward and questions that anyone on Zoom would have. On the screen here, we have some topics that we would probably like to talk about. And I think we'll just open the floor now, and anyone that's out there that would like to talk to us or have a question, please raise your hand virtually and we'll get you in the room.
So I can feel the questions.
Okay, it looks like we have a question from Mike Cunningham. Mike, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Feel free to unmute and state your question.
Yeah, the comment was made earlier regarding wells and PFAS and city water. I know that this Detroit gets a lot of their city water from Lake St. Clair, loaded with PFAS, sunscreens, microplastics found in plastic fishing lures, et cetera, et cetera. What does the city do to remove that PFAS from drinking water or water that comes to our house? And is there something that we can do as residents to remove PFAS from well water at the house level? And if so, is that something that we should be working with our health department for when people to dig wells, that they put some sort of device in place to eliminate PFAS that's going into our wastewater treatment plants, et cetera? That was a multi-level question. So I apologize for that.
Well, granulated activated carbon is really the only treatment process right now.
Oh, the reverse osmosis.
Yeah, and reverse osmosis. So there are a couple of methods, but when you get into the city size, like Detroit, you're talking hundreds of millions of gallons of water with a lot of carbon, and then you still have to remove that carbon and have that incinerated. That's the only way to dispose of it.
So is that something that the city of Detroit does? Or is it something that most water plants do? And I guess my questioning is just because you're on city water, you're not eliminating PFAS unless they do that sort of treatment, correct?
Well, that depends on the type of system that you're on. For example, in Lyon Township, their municipal system is a groundwater well system, and PFAS is not in the drinking water system. Our issue here in Lyon Township is it's in the sewer side. So it's coming through as a pass through from residents with products, not from the drinking water. So, and I can't comment on what Detroit does with their water system. I don't represent them. But just as far as locally, this issue is really on the sewer treatment plants.
Right. So, well, that's kind of what I was alluding to. You know, the water comes from one source that ultimately ends in another. So I guess this is kind of an educational time for our residents that we find out what things PFAS are in and reach out to them and tell them to try avoid using it, right?
So every community well system in the state is required to annually produce a consumer confidence report. And in that consumer confidence report, there are results from PFAS sampling in their systems. Each of those reports hold that. And for one, Great Lakes Water Authority and the Detroit system continues to monitor according to the state standards. And I'm not sure how often they monitor, but their detections are below the drinking water standards that have been established by the state and also the federal government on that piece. So the water that is coming through the system that we're seeing in the consumer confidence reports are below that. There are a number of communities that do have activated carbon, and that is one of the source ways to remove these chemicals and similar chemicals from the drinking water. So there, all of that is in the annual reports that come through to consumers on an annual basis.
All right, thank you for the information.
Tim, could you please state your name and your responsibility?
Yeah, Tim Sickmo with the City of Wixom Department of Public Works. We are members of the Great Lakes Water. We receive water from them.
Thank you. Looks like the next question is from Irvin. Irvin, I'm going to ask you to unmute and state your question.
Yeah, Frank Irvin, Livingston County Drain Commission. We were talking a little bit, there's a slide there for incineration. Incineration, from my understanding, would lead to airborne release of the contaminant, further displacing and spreading it out. What additional studies have been on that? And the biggest thing I'm getting at is the overarching message of collaboration is needed in smart government. I've seen that there were some Eagle representatives on here, and my biggest question is what is being done at the state level, working with federal, of stopping the source?
Well, I think we'll hear the answer, because I think that's one of our questions. We are trying to figure out how we can stop the source. It can't be stopped. What's creating the source? And we really don't know the answer to that question.
It would be great if someone from legal is attending to, let us know what are the source controls.
Want me to ask if anyone from legal?
Yeah. There is anyone?
Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone from Eagle is on this call, but that could be a question that maybe they could answer for us.
I don't know if they're going to be able to respond to the question here, but we'll get names and emails. Maybe we can get through to them.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of questions I think that this body would like to know too. I mean, we're just trying to figure it out also. But we also, like you say, we want to get together. We want to work together as a team to solve this problem. We don't want to be the state against the municipalities, the state against the cities. We're asking just for help. Let's not demonize us. Let's get in the room together. Let's figure it out. And that's basically all we're asking. And that's all we wanted to put this meeting together for. We get just from the Channel 7 news broadcast on the EPA coming out and talking about that has just flooded our phones here at the township of people worried about PFAS. And I think a big part of this process is trying to inform the public on what causes PFAS. And there was a slide, and I don't know if we showed that slide, how information to the public has slowed PFAS in the blood. I think that back in the, you have that slide? If you look
real
at,
quick, we also have Ann from Eagle that has her hand raised. I can
Perfect.
unmute her if you like.
okay, just really quick, let me just show this one slide and then you can bring her in. We had a slide here that shows from 99 to 2000, the blood PFAS was at 30 parts. And you can see the downhill trajectory and I believe that was basically by informing the public on the things you shouldn't use. And that worked very well. So that being said, Ann is on the phone from Eagle, and we'd like to bring her in. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ann. We've requested to unmute your, thank you.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Ann Tabalier with Eagle. I know some of you, but for those who don't know me, I work in the Water Resources Division within the Emerging Pollutant section. I do industrial pretreatment compliance, and Lyon Township is one of my facilities along with Wixom. Hi, Tim. But I also have Sydney Ruhala and Kevin Wojciechowski are also on this call from Eagle. They work with me in the Emerging Pollutant section, and they are the groundwater PFAS specialist with an Emerging Pollutant section. So can the person repeat some of their questions that they had for Eagle? I think there was a few of them. We can maybe try to answer those.
Right.
I think it was Furman, if you're still online.
Frank Irvin?
He was questioning the incineration and if there's going to be emissions from the vapors coming off incinerating. Air quality.
And I think he also asked if the state what is Eagle doing with the state to eliminate the source?
Yes.
Okay. So I can't speak to incineration, but I could offer a contact within our air quality division who is working with EPA. EPA is doing a fair amount of research and testing at their facility. They're trying to develop analytical methods to test for PFAS in air. So I could send that contact information out. So I can't really speak to incineration. I know there are technologies that are looking at incineration as a way to destroy PFAS so that we're not just moving PFAS around, to a landfill, which then discharges back to a wastewater treatment plant. And then the other question was about what Eagle is doing to stop it at the source. So could only speak to Water's program to stop PFAS at the industrial source. We have our industrial pretreatment PFAS initiative that both Lyon Township and the city of Wixom participated in, where they sampled their industrial users under their pretreatment program for PFAS and required those industrial sources to reduce and eliminate. So city of Wixom has 2 facilities that have installed GAC treatment to reduce their PFOS from their discharge. So Eagle has steps for the industrial sources of PFAS. We agree with your sentiment about the need for legislation at the state and federal level about consumer products.
Thank you for answering my questions on that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And could you just speak on the differences between the groundwater discharges versus surface water discharges and how those are regulated differently?
I will phone a friend. I'll ask Sydney if you're able to unmute Sydney Rahala. She can speak better than I can about the groundwater program.
Yep.
Go ahead, Sydney.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Sydney Rahala. As Ann mentioned, I'm a colleague of Ann's in the Water Resources Division with Eagle. I'm also working with a number of the municipalities on this call that have groundwater discharge permits. So, I think ultimately the difference with groundwater discharge permits and those facilities that have NPDES permits that discharge to surface water is really, it comes down to their discharge location and the difference in criteria. So, a surface water discharge permit, they're discharging obviously to a surface water body, and they have to meet the surface water or water quality values for, currently we have 3 types of PFAS that have water quality values. That's PFOS, PFOA, and then PFBS. Whereas the groundwater dischargers, because they discharge to groundwater, they have to meet different criteria, specifically in their monitoring wells. And that is the groundwater cleanup criteria under Part 201 for PFAS. And there are 7 of those that they're protective of the drinking water pathway, and they actually currently match the drinking water MCLs in the state of Michigan. Yeah, it looks like they pulled them up there on the screen. So, for groundwater discharge permittees, those are the 7 PFAS that we're looking at in their monitoring wells. And as was mentioned by a presenter earlier, if any of the monitoring wells were above those values for any of the 7, that would be considered an exceedance of criteria. So really, it comes down to the fact that they have different discharge locations, and therefore they have to meet different criteria. And as you can see, the criteria varies. For PFOA in groundwater, right now it's set at 8 parts per trillion, whereas PFOA in surface waters that are not used as drinking water sources, it's 170 parts per trillion. And so there's quite a big difference there in the numbers. And so it just, unfortunately, wastewater treatment plants that discharge to different locations, they may have more or less PFAS impacts just due to the concentrations that they have at their own plant.
On that topic, this is Pat from Hamburg. Real quickly, we've done a lot of modeling. We are a groundwater discharge plant. We were within a couple hundred yards of the Huron River. Our modeling that was done back 8 or 10 years ago gave evidence of a direct vent into the Huron River from our sand beds due to their proximity and due to the geology there. What is the possibility of a plant such as ours being reclassified from groundwater to surface water based on those models?
Sure. So the way that the Water Resources Division essentially kind of views having to meet criteria in groundwater. So there's, the groundwater protection criteria that's protective of drinking water. And then we also have groundwater protection criteria that's protective of the GSI pathway, or the groundwater surface water interface pathway. And so typically, unless you are able to demonstrate that all of the groundwater vents to the surface water body, you would have to meet both sets of criteria. That's typically how the Water Resources Division views it. If you believe that, the modeling that you have demonstrates that all of your groundwater there is venting to the surface water, and there isn't the possibility for groundwater that could be impacted by your discharge to move beyond the river, I'd recommend maybe talking with your permit writer and the groundwater permits unit to see if they can help evaluate if you have the correct permit with the correct limits. But that would be kind of a process that you'd have to go through with other units in the Water Resources Division.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, we have we have a couple more questions here. Again, just a reminder to anyone that would like to ask a question, we ask that you raise your virtual hand. You'll find it in your toolbar. And then if you're on a regular telephone, you can press *9 to raise your virtual hand. We have a question from Brian Constantine. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, actually, not a question, two comments for the group. Especially the first one with regard to this path forward, and then a comment on the side there about the $2 billion from the Infrastructure Act. I just want to let the group know that I was talking recently with a consultant who is assisting a municipal wastewater treatment plant operation out in Kansas with an application for grant funds under the infrastructure law to deal with PFAS. So there are grant funds out there right now that municipalities can apply for to address this PFAS issue. So get your applications in quickly. And then also the second comment I wanted to make with regard to modifying the law, I think it would actually, you'd have to not only do Part 201, but also you'd have to make a modification to Part 31 because there is language in there that PFAS could be backdoored in. Specifically the language which says that cannot discharge any substance that's injurious to the public health or the environment. So that it could be backdoored in that way. And then specifically under the rules, Part 31 rules, which is Rule 323.22042F, I believe it is. And that rule specifically says that a discharge shall not create a facility as defined in Part 201. So that's in the rules governing these groundwater discharges. That's my two comments there. That's it.
Okay, at this point, I don't see any other hands raised at this time. I think a comment, if we could speak closer to the microphone would be helpful too.
Okay.
Leslie wants to.
Yes. Hi, I'm Leslie Zawada. I am Lyon Township and Green Oak Township's engineer. And my question, Sydney, I was just wondering if you had a comment about the question on if you're aware of any proposed changes to legislation to control, consumer products. Ann commented, but I just wondering about that. And if Eagle has contacted the legislation to try to make modifications, since you are all dealing with this on a daily basis as well.
Yeah, sure. So, I think my comments are going to support Ann's. I think we agree that there does need to be legislation to address consumer products with PFAS and consumer products. We continue to express those concerns to our management that are aware of those who express those concerns to the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, or MPART. And MPART, speaks quite regularly with different representatives and senators across the state. As to specifics as to what's being done, I am not aware of those details, but I do know that it is something. It's a topic that's brought up to MPART to continue working with legislators to try to to show them what's needed to be done to regulate those consumer products. And same goes for funding. We are continuing to look for funding sources for municipalities to address this. We know this is expensive. You guys are not the users or generators of PFAS. It's something that comes to you and passes through your treatment plants, unfortunately. So, but I continue to encourage you guys to work together, to talk to your own reps and senators. I think that'll go a long way as well. I think this call that you guys have organized today was a really great start, and it's great to see you guys working together, and we acknowledge and hear your concerns, and we'll continue to pass those on.
I make one more comment too as well. Sure. So as far as source control, I think because you're looking at all these consumer products being in the stream of commerce, you're looking at a lot of these sources being in other states and other countries. I think it's got to be also a larger solution. It can't just be Eagle. It needs to go, really to EPA to look at some of these generators and how that's handled, uniformly nationwide. So I think that's also from a legislation perspective, even if Eagle can help getting in contact with the right people at the EPA to, express the concerns of what's going on statewide and how it needs to be uniform nationwide. And on how, how this is handled from a legislative perspective as far as the generators.
Okay, we have a question from Greg. Greg, go ahead and unmute and proceed.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for organizing this, first of all. Just a couple comments and then a question on the end about how to proceed forward. I think one of the things that's frustrating about this too is even if you think you've done everything right, this is still going to be an impact to you. In our particular instance, we've had 2 groundwater discharge facilities that 20 years ago and 8 years ago, we took off from being groundwater discharge, directed those to surface water. We now are having to sample and do control for the PFAS from the historic discharge. So we were required by Eagle last year to go back and look at their our old monitoring wells from our old groundwater discharge plants, and PFAS was there because, of course, it's been around since the 1950s, and these are 100% residential, much like Hamburger, 100% residential plants, no industries, and there's PFAS there above the drinking water standard. Same thing goes to biosolids. In 2015, we switched to pressing all of our biosolids and going away from land application. And we've seen our costs double since 2015 for biosolids disposal. So we've gone from about 100,000 gallon or $100,000 a year to well over $200,000 a year now for transport and disposal costs as the landfills gear up to protect themselves from PFAS. And so I think even if you think you've done everything right, it's still going to be a looming issue for all of us. And I guess just my question regarding moving forward is, what do we think is our best? Do we write a letter? Do we get all of our governmental agencies to pass resolutions and submit those as a block to our legislatures? Because as I understand, I heard that 3M is going to ban PFAS production beginning in 2026, but DuPont has not stated anything with regard to that. And then there's currently nothing going on with regard to things coming from overseas with PFAS containing in it. So I don't know. This is going to be with us for a long time, and I guess I don't know what the path is moving forward. But I guess my concern is, what do we think is our best thing to reduce our potential liability and costs going forward? Because, like Pat said, the residents are going to be mad at us. They're not going to be mad at anybody else. So.
Okay, thank you. Bob, it looked like your hand was up for a moment. Did you want to add any comments, any additional comments? So I'll turn it back to you, John, if there are any additional comments.
Okay, well, first of all, I would like to thank everyone that joined the Zoom and everyone in this room, and for the Eagle participants, because I think that's super important that they be part of this, because, one thing, and I think you can hear it from the group here, we are not saying that PFAS is not a problem. We are all in this room saying it's absolutely a problem. It has taken many, many years to get here. We would like to collaborate, as everyone here has said, with Eagle and not be put on these 201 lists, because as soon as we get put on these 201 lists, it terrifies our residents, for one thing. And our residents, we have to explain it's not in our drinking water. And we have several clay layers before it gets to our drinking water. And we do check our water on a constant basis. But when we get put on a map and we get this 201 designation about hazardous substances, it terrifies our residents. And we spend more time answering the telephone around here, reassuring our public that our drinking water is safe because it's under the same category as our drinking water, and it's a ground surface discharge. And all we're asking, and there's nobody, and I can say it for everybody in this room, there's nobody that's saying it is not a problem. We just want to know, as everyone has said, the sources are still coming, and we don't know, we have one IPP in our township, and, our businesses, we go after them. But I think it's everybody. I think everybody is contributing to the source of the groundwater. And all we're asking is to please, the entire state of Michigan is going to be non-compliant before too long. And what are we going to do then? I mean, I think we just have to work as a team, and instead of spending our resources testing, let's figure out a solution. Let's figure out the path forward as being, what can we all do, including Eagle, to get in the room and say, okay, it's a problem. It's coming out at this number. Let's make it better. Let's fix it. And we all know that everybody here can't afford to do that. That's the funding problem that we won't be able to afford. But that's what we're stuck with. So that's what it's all about. And I just wanted to, again, thank everyone for participating today. And this was not an adversarial meeting whatsoever. This was actually trying to get everybody on the same page to understand we want to work this out. And that's all we have. And again, I want to thank everybody. And if anyone has any final comments, other than that, we'll close this meeting. Anyone else would like to say it? It's the last chance to raise your hand, or we're going to.
I'm seeing no hands raised online at this time.
Okay, then we're going to close the meeting. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to stop recording in 3, 2, 1.